Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. And we're so grateful that you listen to the show. We're so grateful that you support the show. You can do that by going to jeffersonhour.com. You can contact us through that website, or you can donate to the show or support the show in whatever way you'd like to. Things got a little out of hand this week towards the end of the show, simply in the sense of timekeeping. As usual, we had this great conversation with Lindsay Chervinsky. This week's subject is Benjamin Franklin, and there were so many things that we didn't really have time for in the show. I guess I started it off by talking about what a prolific author he was and how early he retired, and then off and running the conversation went. And so I'm not going to say any more, but we're going to insert that sort of overtime section here, if that's all right with you, sir.
1706 to 1790, one of the greatest men in human history, an inventor, a raconteur, a diplomat, a constitution writer, brilliant wit, and a scientist of very considerable acumen. So we're lucky to be able to talk about him with Lindsay Chervinsky.
She's just so much fun. It's sad that people can't see her face because we're doing this on Zoom because she's so expressive. Let's listen to this little overtime conversation, then we'll come back.
Fair enough.
We didn't even get into what a prolific writer he was and how he retired at age 42. We'll have to bring that up in the podcast.
And we didn't talk about Poor Richard, not once.
Yeah.
There's just too much for,
What's your admiration level of him, Lindsay? I'm guessing mine's higher, but
I think maybe because he was of a different generation, I've just never felt the same sort of connection, whether it be positive or negative, that I often feel with the later generations. And I think that's just because I haven't done as much reading on the colonial period, and so and I haven't done as much reading on the history of science. So it's just I don't feel the same sense either strongly or negatively that I do about others. I mean, I think what I admire most about him is that you can take pretty much any topic and connect it. It's like 7 degrees of Kevin Bacon. Is that what it is? But you could do 7 degrees of Benjamin Franklin. And I admire his brilliance. I feel like he's he feels more aloof to me than George Washington does, which most people wouldn't say, but I feel like the availability he provides is fake. And so I've never totally grasped him.
But you've spent a bunch of the last decade of your life with George Washington.
This is true. It's not totally a fair statement.
You have a familiarity with the great one in his more unguarded times than most people ever will. And I think you've done enormously important work for all of us in looking at George Washington in that way. I had another question which we didn't get to, and that was that, during the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, Franklin actually led militia troops at one point. I mean, you never think of Franklin in war, because he said there was never a bad peace or a good war, and he's very much a pacifist in many respects. But he was suddenly, the least likely person you would ever expect is leading militia troops out into the Ohio frontier. And that's where he and Washington are kind of in tandem.
He is a man of many chapters. It's why it's so hard to narrow down this material, because we could talk about, of course, Poor Richard's Almanac. We could talk about his childhood. We could talk about the printing press. We could talk about his emphasis on education. We didn't even really get the University of Pennsylvania. I mean, just on and on and on.
Talk about invention.
Yeah.
And that and there are brilliant biographies, and let's just recommend a couple. H.W. Brands has a biography called The First American, and Gordon Wood has a terrific book, really bigger than Franklin, but it's called The Americanization of Ben Franklin. What are you looking at, Lindsay?
Yeah, I would recommend that one as well. There's and I actually think of Wood's books, I think it's among his best. So, and I think it's one of his older ones too. So I know, there's various different disagreements about his more recent work, but this one I do highly recommend. There's a book, Benjamin Franklin in London, which looks at his time there, and that is fantastic because it really emphasizes the importance of that intellectual and scientific community to shaping his identity.
So when the Burns film comes out, David, I don't know if it's 3 hours or 30 hours, you can never tell with Ken Burns, but if I watch it and the only thing I say in all those hours is, hey, he flew a kite, I'll have to kill myself now because
You need to live tweet it. You need to live tweet your watching.
I trained for that. Never before. I so wanted to be in this film. And I didn't ask to be in it. He asked me, but then I thought I'd better step up. And I read 6 or 7 books and reread the autobiography and memorized things and had dates and had cards and so on. And I thought, this is my moment. And sure as shooting now, I'm going to say some vapid thing that Lindsay will dispute, or there'll be eye rolling at her mountain retreat.
Careful, sir, your insecurity is showing.
It is, because you never know, and you never know. And I memorized that incredible thing about valet de chambres and scullery wenches and so on. And then you think, oh, yeah, he can put anything in any one of his films he wants and dump anything that he wants too. He has the hand on the lever, and you know, David, from
yeah, the best. Having spent all these years editing you and your dialogue, the best thing you ever told me about Ken Burns was how he gave you the instruction during the interview that you needed to...
No, he said, if you want to be in my films, stick the landing. Say what you're going to say and then stop.
People have this habit of always ending their sentences up, so an editor can't say, that's a period, cut.
And then we say, and another thing, and another thing, and another thing, and another thing.
Well, you just have so much you want to share.
Well, yeah, exactly. But then he said, I can't use it if I can't cut it. And the best person in the world of this is George Will. When he's in a Burns film, whether he says anything interesting or not, he looks in the camera, he makes his statement for 13 seconds and then stops, and you realize, oh, that's going in. That gets in.
Yeah, you really have to master the soundbite. That's also true with like radio and if you're doing broadcast television, if you can master the soundbite, they will have you back.
Well, I will let you both know that there are now ways and fairly simple ways to take a statement by a person and change the pitch of his last word. And believe me, I've done it. It works quite well.
To me, no doubt. So, Lindsay, what...
I didn't say that, but yes.
Were you it was the Doris Kearns Goodwin History Channel, Washington, or what was the Washington?
Yeah. That one came out in February 2020, right before the pandemic hit. There have been a couple of other ones that I have filmed since then. I don't know when they're going to be released. I think all of them are slated for release this year, but I haven't received actual publication dates. So I will be sure to let you know once I hear that. I will say the funniest part for me about the Washington one was I was talking about the newspaper editors. Actually, this is a good tie into this episode. Benjamin Franklin Bosch, Franklin's grandson, who was the editor of the Aurora newspaper, delivered 3 copies of his newspaper every day to Washington's house.
I love this story.
Even though Washington was not a subscriber, and he just did it to make him mad.
And he did.
It worked so well. But in the story, I said, he did it just to piss him off. And Washington was really pissed. And they left that in. Now, I'm, I suppose, of younger generation. I did not know that pissed was a swear word. Apparently, some people consider pissed to be a swear word. So they left it in. It was hilarious. Everyone thought it was really funny, except then I got a series of emails. I will allow you to guess the, makeup of the people sending them, saying, you have a PhD. You should use more elegant language. You should not be swearing on television. So I wrote back and I said, I'm sorry, I pissed you off.
Wow, you said that. But
yeah.
Finish the story. So Washington's getting 3 copies of this paper, and then one day he appears and he's like shaking the paper with his fist. Tell the rest of the story.
Yeah, so he complains about it in cabinet meetings, and he talks about how these editors are being impudent and are trying to literally, they're trying to insult him. And Jefferson writes it down. And he's right. They are trying to insult him. And in fact, several generations of newspaper editors did so because Freneau was the first one to do it. And then Bosch took over once Freneau closed his newspaper and did the same thing.
But didn't Washington say, 3 copies, what does he want me to be, a distributor for this thing? I mean, he went nuts over it.
Oh, yeah, he completely lost his temper.
The Freneau incident where Madison and Jefferson hire Philip Freneau as a clerk in a sinecure in the State Department, and he creates an opposition newspaper to the Washington administration, has to be said is one of the lowest moments of Jefferson's life.
Oh, it's the lowest of, well, I don't know if it's the lowest of the low, but it's certainly the lowest of his political life.
What, I mean, if that's not disloyalty, what is? Just before you go, 4 hours today, what have you been doing besides this?
Oh, I recorded another podcast for Monticello earlier today, and then I had just some other phone calls for other projects that either sort of wrap up phone calls or people who just had some questions, things like that. And I try to carve out times during the week where I have no things so that I have time to write and read and read deeply. And so I end up jamming a lot of things into like 1 or 2 days. And so I end up with, a lot of things.
When we end this podcast intro, this sort of impromptu intro, I know that Clay is going to do his weekly pitch. How about you? How's your paperback edition doing?
Oh, I think it's doing pretty well. I mean, it's kind of hard to know with, tracking these things can be really difficult because you can see certain things on Amazon, but it's only a small portion of how things are going. But
take a moment and tell everybody, give us some details. Give us a pitch.
The Cabinet.
Thank you. Yes, the book is The Cabinet, George Washington and the Creation of an American Institution. The paperback came out on February 8th. It is very reasonably priced at $17.95, which is very nice. You can buy it at any of your favorite online retailers, or your local bookstore can order it for you at the same price. It is the story of how Washington created the president's cabinet outside of any legal or constitutional guidelines when he was responding in real time to the challenges that faced the new nation at its founding, and created an institution and a precedent that is still with us today.
And it's a great read, and I know that Jefferson Hour podcast listeners can find that episode when you were on and talked about that book.
The Cabinet, George Washington and the Creation of an American Institution by Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky. So just tell us, this was the highlight of your day.
Of course it was the highlight of my day. You guys are always the highlight of my day. I have so much fun. You energize me. I get to put all of my sarcasm that I have to button up on other podcasts into our conversations and our productions, and then I get to look forward to the next one.
Wow, I was watching her face pretty close. I don't think there was any snark in that statement.
No, but I think there was some irony, like all the bottled up rage and hate I have, I get to deliver to you two knuckleheads.
Speak for yourself. Thanks, Lindsay.
We'll see you soon, our friend.
That was our sort of overtime extra to this week's podcast. Before we go, Clay, I know you've got things coming up that you want to talk about. In particular, people can watch Ken Burns' Ben Franklin. But you have some other things coming up. You have a trip to France that you want people to know about. The
France trip is in the fall and it's starting to fill. People should come. It's incredibly interesting. And so that's in the fall of 2022.
And if they need any inspiration for that, they should listen to the interview you just did with Derek Baxter. That was great.
Wasn't that fun? And then there's the online course that's about to start, which is The Enlightenment and Its Discontents. And we're going to read Gulliver's Travels, Voltaire's Candide. Voltaire came up today. And Yuval Harari's recent book, Homo Deus, about the future of humankind. And I can't wait for that. But I just want to crow here a little, David. See what I've done? We've roped Lindsay into doing part of the podcast intro too. She's going to get wise to this one of these days.
It's great.
You and I we're going to be furloughed here shortly.
Just pawns in the game. So shall we go to this week's episode, sir?
Yes, go to jeffersonhour.com for all of this.
Our apologies for this long podcast intro. I hope we haven't lost anyone, but let's go to the program.
Thanks everyone for listening. Keep listening. Send us your letters, and if you have the wherewithal to help us, we'd be thrilled. Let's go to the show.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to this week's Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm your host, David Swenson. I'm joined by the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson, and we are both so pleased to welcome back Lindsay Chervinsky for another of our 10 Things conversations. Although this week it might be difficult to keep the list to just 10 things, as our person of discussion is Benjamin Franklin. I suspect this could easily be 2 or 3 programs, but part of the reason the two of you picked Franklin is the upcoming film by Ken Burns, Benjamin Franklin, which premieres on April 4th. And Clay, you are the perfect witness to talk about this documentary, having been part of its production, sir.
I felt so honored to be asked by Dayton Duncan and Ken Burns, both friends of yours, David, to fly to Boston and go over to Walpole, New Hampshire to be interviewed. And when you're interviewed by Ken Burns, they don't tell you anything in advance. You just show up, and then Ken Burns, with his extraordinary visage, sits about 2 feet from you, and he says, well, who was Benjamin Franklin? And you're off and running, and it lasts about 2 hours. And when you leave, you wish you could either drown yourself or start over again, and you remember every bad thing you said. I don't know if this happens to you, Lindsay. You realize you're an idiot, you don't deserve this. Every time I've ever been interviewed by him, it's been about 6 times now, I begged for a re-interview, and he always says, no, nobody gets a re-interview.
I really love that description. That's really funny. I guess I wish that I had that experience. Whenever I do these things, I walk out and I have no recollection of what I said. I have no memory of whatever took place. Even, the Washington 3-part documentary series that was on the History Channel, I recorded for like 5 hours for that, and I had no memory. I walked out and I had no memory. It's like my brain is just, whoop, it's completely blank.
You're on autopilot in there.
Yeah, well, and I think also, I try and put so much energy into it that when it finally, the camera stops rolling and you allow your adrenaline to start to come down, it's such a great, I have such a great high feeling because I love doing these things. And then it's like it starts to sort of collapse, and all of a sudden you're sitting in a puddle on the floor and you're like, yeah, I can't move. I guess I'm here for a while.
Puddle on the floor. I think I've heard you use that phrase, Clay.
Yeah, and when I get back to the hotel, I'm always thinking, was that 1780? Was that Shakespeare, or was it Homer?
I'm sure that they fact check for you.
They do fact check, but the thing is that, as you know, Lindsay, that Ken Burns can ask anyone on earth to be in his films, and almost everyone will say yes. So I feel so thrilled that he reaches down so far to include me, and then I think, cutting room floor. Well,
it's always hard to imagine what Ken Burns is going to present because he does it so well. But do you have any feel for what this documentary is going to be like, Clay?
Spectacular, of course. It's going to have all. He has a huge budget, more than any other documentary filmmaker. There's a certain Ken Burns style, as we all know. And so there are some expected things like the Ken Burns effect on wandering up paintings and photographs and street scenes. And, there will be lots of scenes in London and scenes in Boston and Paris because the budget is big enough to accommodate all of that. I know one thing. I never prepare for these things. I just read a book and turn up, banking on what I think I know. But this time I actually went into training like a guy trying out for, the Class C tournament in basketball or something. And so there was one thing I really, really, really wanted to say, and it's on the list. Can I start with that, David?
Absolutely.
So John Adams, as you know, Lindsay, was not a great fan of Dr. Franklin. He had good reasons to be upset with Franklin. And then he had his usual John Adams envy and vitriol and so on. But he did say this, and I memorized this for the Ken Burns film, and he let me say it. And if this gets into the film, I will say, as Jefferson did, nunc dimittis. Now you may dismiss me. My work is done. Lindsay, this is what Adams said about Benjamin Franklin. I choke up every time I read this. His name was familiar to governments and to people, to foreign courtiers, nobility, clergy, and philosophers, as well as plebeians, to such a degree that there was scarcely a peasant or a citizen, a valet de chambre, a coachman or a footman, a lady's chambermaid, or a scullion in a kitchen who did not consider him as a friend to humankind. When they spoke of him, they seemed to think he was to restore the golden age. Wow. Coming from Adams.
He could really turn a phrase.
And it's so true. I mean, that Franklin was, in some ways, the first world citizen, and he was beloved by the commoners all the way down to a kitchen wench and, a valet, and then up to the highest circles of the aristocracy, that he was universally admired except by a tiny handful of people who didn't. But most of the world thought that he embodied everything that was right with civilization, including the American dream, because, as you know, he came from nothing and became one of the most important people on earth. And so that was, in a sense, the very embodiment of what America stood for.
I love that you started there, and I think that's such a good place to begin because he really did stand for the American dream, the potential of the American experiment, all that could be accomplished with education and the resources of North America and science and space. What I found to be so interesting when I was doing reading for this project is that he was indeed, the first American. He was the first American that everyone knew. He was the first global citizen. He was a master, and I think we'll get more into some of these details, but he was a master of symbolism and styled himself as the ultimate consummate American. And yet he was deeply insecure about how he was remembered. He was adored across Europe, but he didn't feel that he was adored across the United States all the time. And that was partly because he spent so much of his life away from the United States. And so he was deeply insecure about how he was remembered, his legacy, whether Americans trusted him, whether he was going to have this, role in the pantheon. He was sort of jealous of the envy. He was envious of the symbolism and the gratitude that he saw that Americans had for people like Washington and Adams. And of course, Adams thought that they had it for him and, for Franklin and not for him. And so I think that worry about his role in history is one of the more human elements of him, and one that we often don't think about because history has written, him into the story, and he's been such a huge part of the American creation. So those concerns that he had, I think, were often forgotten.
We have to keep in mind that Benjamin Franklin was born in 1706, at the very beginning of the 18th century. He's really a person from a previous era from the American Revolution. So by the time the Revolution comes, and particularly the Constitutional Convention, he's an old man. Jefferson is like a grandson to him. Jefferson is 1743. I think Washington was at 1734?
1732.
1732. So these are youngsters compared to the eminent Dr. Franklin, and they look at him as sort of almost a person from a pantheon of great ones from a preceding age.
Absolutely. I mean, by the time they were, when they were still in figurative diapers, Franklin had already created militias. He had created libraries. He had been to London. He was working. He was married. He had, illegitimate children and then legitimate children. He had created these societies. He was a remarkable figure and very well known when they were still babies. And so when it came time for the revolution, in some ways that made him a very necessary leader, but in some ways it also made him a little bit questionable.
Out of the loop.
Because he had built this career in the British system. I mean, they all considered themselves to be deeply loyal British citizens until they weren't. But he especially had all of these royal positions. He had real reason to be a loyal citizen, unlike, maybe Jefferson and Washington, who kind of felt they had been thwarted. And so he really did a 180 to become this revolutionary figure.
So just before David takes us back to our list, so that in two cases, I mean, Franklin and Washington, certainly, if the British had been more generous to them, they might have stayed loyal, because Washington was very upset during the French and Indian War when he was treated like a mere colonial and put down in every way. If he had gotten the plum positions he wanted in the British Army, who knows what would have happened. And Franklin was on the rise in British circles and could have taken it farther. And when he was stymied by the Brits, then he came back to the U.S. And as you know, when he came back to the U.S. after that long period away, many Americans were suspicious that he wasn't really on board with the revolution.
Well, I think a good way to envision that is he lived in London longer than he lived in any one place at one time. Of course, he came back to Philadelphia time and time again. But the most concentrated chunk of time and the house he lived in the longest was his house in London. And I can understand why Americans would be suspicious of that.
And we don't do scandalmongery here, but he had a second family in England.
He did. Of course we do scandalmongering. What are you talking about?
You too. I would almost make a suggestion that we suspend the rule of lists this week. I will draw us back to some of the subjects.
Well, give us one more from the list to set us up.
Here's a small one before we take our break. I don't know what this is about. You wrote, Clay, about the famous 2 loaves of bread to Philadelphia?
So Ben Franklin wrote an autobiography, which is considered one of the great early documents in American history.
It's also one of the great pieces of fiction.
There she goes. But
Welcome back, Lindsay.
Thanks.
I wondered where she was. But he, we talk now about self-fashioning. He created a persona in that autobiography, which was not quite the true Benjamin Franklin, and it was wildly successful. But one of the stories he tells about himself is when he escaped from Boston to go to Philadelphia. He was just a kid, a teenager, and he knows almost nothing and knows nobody there really. But he has just enough money to buy a loaf of bread. So he goes into this bake shop and says he gives them, 2 pence or something to buy a loaf of bread. And they give him 2 large loaves, and you have to get the sense that they're the size of a big football or a small basketball. And then he realized he got too much, that he looks ridiculous. But of course he's hungry too, and he has to save food. So he's carrying these 2 loaves down the street. And then coming out of a doorway is this young, attractive woman, Deborah, who later becomes his wife. And he said, "Thus I made my grand entry into the intellectual capital of the British Empire to Philadelphia." It's just a fabulous story. I think it's probably true, if a little bit exaggerated, but this is the kind of thing he was famous for. Jefferson could never, under any circumstances, have told this story.
That's a great story. I'd forgotten that. We need to take a short break, but we will return in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Welcome back to the special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour of Lindsay Chervinsky, 10 Things About the Great Dr. Benjamin Franklin. And Lindsay, I want to get your opinion about something. If you ask 100 people in public, tell me about Dr. Franklin, they'll say, oh, the ladies in France, he loved the ladies, and so on. And he had all these affairs, and so on. I've always doubted that, but let me read from a letter written in 1784 by none other than Abigail Adams about the meeting of Franklin and Madame Helvetius. And Abigail Adams is basically a small-town Puritan from the New World, and she's shocked by French manners. And she says that Madame Helvetius came in, and she said, "Where's Franklin?" And then she said, "How I look," said she, taking hold of a chemise made of Tiffany, which she had on over a blue lute-string, which looked much upon the decay as her beauty, for she was once a handsome woman. Her hair was frizzled. Over it she had a small hat with a dirty gauze handkerchief around it, and a bit dirtier gauze than ever my maids wore. She had a black gauze scarf thrown over her shoulders. She ran out of the room, and when she returned, the doctor entered at one door, she at the other, upon which she ran forward to him, caught him by the hand. "Hellos, Franklin!" then gave him a double kiss, one on each cheek and another on his forehead. When they went into the room to dine, she was placed between the doctor and my husband, Mr. Adams. She carried on the chief of the conversation at dinner, frequently locking her hand in the doctor's and sometimes spreading her arms upon the backs of both gentlemen's chairs, then throwing her arm carelessly on the doctor's neck. And then it gets worse because she has a little lapdog that wets the floor, and Abigail Adams says with horror, and she just took her dress and mopped up the urine from the floor. So that's a very famous story, of course, Lindsay. What do you say about the reputation of Franklin in informal American memory as this sort of womanizer?
In defense of the great Abigail Adams, if I saw someone clean up dog urine with their dress while wearing it, I am no Puritan, and I too would be horrified at this behavior. So that just has to be said.
You've never seen this. You've never seen this at a party in Charlottesville.
It's not a usual party trick that I come across. I have to confess. With Franklin and the ladies, I think that the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. There's no doubt that he was a great flirt and enjoyed it very much. And was probably also a little bit of a creepy old man, because by the time he was doing all this flirting, he was definitely on the older side. And I think some of it was probably just, affectionate fun. But there are these stories of these young women in scantily dressed, sitting in his lap.
Don't you think that there's partly the older man, that he's too old to be a threat? He's just kind of, he's safe. He's a safe roue. He's safely flirtatious, don't you think?
I think some of it was safe. I am sure that there were marital indiscretions. He was away from his wife for 20 years. I very seriously doubt he kept to any vows for that amount of time. And that I don't think is necessarily a reflection of him and more a reflection of 18th century societal norms, not to necessarily absolve him of that behavior. But I do think that there's probably something there. Now, his being a fan of the ladies, I'm not sure necessarily translated to a sense of equality. He was away from his wife for 20 years and left her, I mean, there's like some not great behavior there. Left her to deal with children. She was doing poorly in health and he didn't really try and get back. She died before he got back. Not ideal. So I think that a lot of it was, he was charming. He was a safe person to flirt with. He often used that affability as a diplomatic tool, and women were very important intellectual figures in France. And so there was certainly the madam that you spoke about had these really important intellectual circles. So I think there was certainly an element there. But I don't think his love of the ladies should be conflated with a sense of what we would think of as feminism or equality.
Neither one. He's no Jeffrey Epstein. He's no predator. And he also,
no.
But he's not a feminist, and he doesn't believe in female equality. And his treatment of his wife at times is really upsetting. But I think that Franklin knew something about diplomacy that John Adams couldn't even see, which is that diplomacy is not two diplomatic men in a room hammering out a decision or an agreement. Franklin had a much more suave and indirect approach to this. Adams thought he was lazy, indolent, narcissistic, and to be sure, Franklin probably was all of those things in some part. But he also knew how to play the long game diplomatically, and he was brilliant at it.
Yeah, I think, in terms of if you were to think about the different types of diplomatic roles that one could have, the long game of Franklin's diplomacy in France as a long-term minister, he was perfectly suited for that. He did brilliantly during the war to ensure that French support continued to flow and to develop and to cultivate this alliance. But when the time came to negotiate that peace treaty with Great Britain, I think that he was not particularly well suited for that. And John Jay and John Adams played a very essential role in making sure American interests were protected first as opposed to French interests.
Well, let me ask you this then. It's often thought that Franklin and Franklin alone got us the French alliance in 1778. Do you think that's overstated?
Yes. I mean, he certainly was one of the more important roles. And I think that so much of his work was the symbolic work. It wasn't necessarily even the negotiations. It was building a sense of what the American identity was and representing that as a figurehead. It was, showing up to Versailles in the simple Quaker clothing, and that the French loved that. And so because the French loved him and loved this concept of America that he presented, it helped to build the groundswell of support for the alliance. And that's, I think, his biggest contribution.
Noting Franklin's great contributions, I always look for pivotal points in history, and I'd like to read something from Rick Atkinson's brilliant book, The British Are Coming. In the prologue, he writes, on January 29, 1774, Franklin appeared before the King's Council in the Cockpit, a Whitehall amphitheater once used for cockfights. For more than an hour, Franklin was pelted with invective, denounced as a man without honor and a hoary-headed traitor who had forfeited all respect of societies and men. The packed gallery jeered while he stood as still as statuary, wearing a fine blue suit of spotted Manchester velvet. It was the greatest humiliation of his life. He then goes on to talk about Franklin writing 20,000 words to his son, William, which was a detailed account of his failed diplomacy in Britain, and then writes, that failure had taught him lessons in patience, tact, intrigue, and power, lessons that would prove useful since his best days as a diplomat, perhaps the greatest America ever produced, still lay ahead of him. The Pennsylvania packet shrugged off her moorings and crowded on sail, bearing him home where he belonged.
Franklin leaked a couple of documents to the press. And it was thought to be entirely inappropriate for him to have done so. He exposed some people in the British ministry and in Pennsylvania in a way that was pretty wild. And so he was brought into this special room in Westminster that's called the cockpit. This, you have to think of it kind of like almost a surgeon's arena, with the chairs around it. And he was made to stand for several hours, and he was browbeaten and rebuked in the most vicious terms by effectively the British Prime Minister. What's your sense of it, Lindsay?
Yeah, so at this moment, he was not only there as a representative of Pennsylvania, but then all of the other colonies had sort of adopted him as a representative in these trade discussions. This is as tensions are beginning to escalate. Parliament has passed a series of bills that have various different tax measures, and the colonists want someone to speak for their interests. And Franklin is there. He's done a pretty good job of it thus far. He has excellent relationships with all of the people in power. And this moment, that these tensions had been building for a while, and so he was kind of in an uncomfortable situation because he saw himself as both a Briton and an American. I mean, they didn't really call themselves Americans at the time, but he had identified with Pennsylvania and Boston, but also saw himself as a Briton and loved his time in London, desperately loved it. So he was really stuck in between a rock and a hard place. And this moment was so humiliating and demonstrated to him that the powers that be in Britain did not see him as an equal, did not see colonists as an equal, that it was the breaking point for him. And I'm glad you brought it up, David, because it wasn't really clear which way he was going to go. And in fact, of course, as we know, his son remained loyal to the crown and was a royal governor. And so there was a lot of reason for him to remain loyal, but it was so humiliating to him that he really turned against the crown and turned against Parliament and went home and then spent the next several years proving that he was indeed loyal to the cause of independence.
Must have been hard on him to have to prove this to the American people, but he did. So just a couple of things about that. So one is that you were right, David. The British drove him into rebellion, and who knows what he would have done had they treated him with greater tolerance on that occasion. As Lindsay says, he was in a very difficult position because the revolution was percolating and he was trying to kind of stay out of both sides' line of fire on this, and found himself not just victimized, but in that excruciating moment where he's standing in that cockpit. It must have been one of the hardest moments of his life. And his son remained loyal. This drove a wedge between them. And what's so horrifying, and I got to talk about this in the interview with Ken Burns, we'll see if it's in the film, but after the war was over and his son had gone to prison in the United States and some very difficult actual prison conditions, and when everything finally cleared and his son was back out in the world, he wrote to his father and said, "You're my father. We should probably try to work this out." And Franklin said, "No, I want nothing to do with you."
I get the sense from Franklin that he was a very different person to those that were not super close to him than he was to those that were close. He could be incredibly loving and kind and generous. He established pretty much every charitable or civic-minded institution in Philadelphia, and education and, anything you can think of, he basically founded it. He was, as you said, beloved across nations, across the globe. And yet when it came to his wife, when it came to his children, he could be very cold and very harsh. And it was almost like he couldn't let people in. The friendliness was the mask that worked really well. The warmth and close and personableness didn't work so well up close.
What's so interesting, David, is that here's this guy who, when you imagine Franklin, you see him in a room with others. You always see him with others, telling a story to cheer Jefferson up over the Declaration of Independence, or an amusing anecdote here, or a dinner party or a salon in Paris. You always see Franklin in a social world. But the fact is, he spent most of his life alone in a room with the English language. He's a very voluminous writer and a printer. And so we think of him as this social creature, but when he was alone, his writings were much more pointed than his conversation was. And we'll get to one at the end about slavery. But I think you're right. I mean, you started, Lindsay, by saying that he was self-fashioning and kind of created the persona of the genial Dr. Franklin. Behind that mask, that persona, was a somewhat different human being who could be vindictive.
This incident in the cockpit in Britain has led to his relations with his son and his family. He was humiliated in Britain. And, Britain really blew it because they had a friend there that probably could have led to maybe not such an awful outcome with the Americans. But they humiliated him, and he said, I'm done with you. He left, made the decision right then and there to go back to America, return to America as a hero. And he kind of did the same thing with his son. You treated me poorly, I'm done with you forever.
So, Lindsay, let me ask you a question. Could the revolution have been avoided? People like Jefferson are always saying, nobody wishes more than I to remain a citizen of Britain if they will only, conciliate and so on. Was it inevitable by 1775, or if George III had been less stubborn? I mean, what are the chances that this could have been worked out, do you think?
Well, I don't think that a status quo could have remained forever. By the 1770s, the colonies were so large and were beginning to be so economically and culturally and politically mature that remaining in subservient colonial status was probably very unlikely for long, especially because it was a very well-educated society. It was a very literate society. It was a society that partook in British politics with gusto. So the concept and the political discourse about rights and freedom and representation that was a very central part of the British identity was, of course, going to infect American discourse as well. So I think that something would have happened. The most likely outcome to avoid war would have been to create a Commonwealth arrangement like the one that ended up happening with Australia and Canada, to retain some oversight, but to give a fair amount of independence and local autonomy over governance. I don't think that would have been acceptable to the powers that be in Britain, and the king in particular. I know at some point we're going to do an episode on King George III, and he was an ardent defender of monarchical power. And so it took the revolution for the British government to think creatively about other types of colonial holdings. So I don't think if you have the Commonwealth without the revolution, but that kind of leads to a, catch-22.
We need to take a break in a few minutes, but before we do, and we still have Franklin somewhat in France, there was one of your points, Clay, was about the meeting of Franklin and Voltaire, the embrace.
I'm so glad you brought that up. I was just going to bring it up myself before we leave France for the U.S. In 1778, in April, Adams and Franklin were meeting. They were both ministers in France. Franklin was essentially the ambassador, and Adams was there on a more generalized mission. And, of course, they had a lot of tension between them. And they were meeting, and they went over to the Academy of Sciences, which was the #1 intellectual salon in France. It was the equivalent of the Royal Society in Britain or the American Philosophical Society in the United States, which, by the way, Franklin created. And they went there and they were listening to a bunch of papers and a bunch of obituaries and so on. And then suddenly there was kind of a buzzing in the crowd in this place, and everyone realized Voltaire is here. Now, Voltaire is to France what Franklin is to the U.S., but on steroids. Voltaire is like the great man of the Enlightenment, the genius above all geniuses. And here was Franklin from the U.S. and Voltaire, and they were sort of seen as occupying the same intellectual positions in their societies. And so the crowd began to murmur. And then it soon became clear that they wanted Franklin to meet Voltaire. He never had. And so Franklin is like, okay. So he goes over and they are sort of bowing to each other and so on. And then the crowd said, they must shake hands. They must shake hands. And they did. And that wasn't enough. And then the crowd said, they must embrace in the French style. They must embrace in the French style. And finally, they do embrace and kiss each other on the cheek in the French manner. And the crowd is thrilled by this essential meeting of the two greatest men of the age. And you can imagine John Adams just dying of disgust, envy, just rolling his eyes and thinking, oh, give me a break. Lindsay, you're looking something up.
So I actually have the description here of John Adams writing about this event, which is hilarious because, as you can say, I mean, you can just feel his eyes rolling out of his head at the moment. But I love the last line when he's describing what the cry was from the crowd. And he says, and the cry immediately spread through the whole kingdom, and I suppose over all Europe. How charming it was! Oh, it was enchanting to see Solon and Sophocles embracing. And you can just feel the sarcasm dripping from
Poor Adams, and I'm sure part of him thought, hey, Voltaire should be hugging me.
Okay, well, this segment is complete now. You've made fun of Adams one more time. With that, we're going to take a short break. We will return to this conversation in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Welcome back to this special Lindsay Chervinsky edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. She's our frequent guest in our 10 Things program.
And in spite of her snark, we are so glad to have her here.
You know, people can't see her expressions. I can, and so they're wounding. I will say that. They're wounding. But I want to start with this. So here's what Jacques Turgot said of Franklin. It's Latin, but it's one of the great... I mean, who would not want this Latin epigram? He said, Irripuit coela fulmen sceptrumque tyrannis, which translates, he ripped lightning from the skies and the scepter from kings. How great is that? You know, Alexander Pope said, wit is what oft was thought, but never so well expressed. He ripped scepters from the king's heads and lightning from the skies. Lindsay, we think of him sort of as this doddering guy with the long white hair over his shoulder, out with a kite, but that's not true at all. He was a very major scientist.
Yeah, I think the reason we so often underplay or downplay his scientific accomplishments is because most of them happened earlier in his life. And so we focus on the Revolutionary era because that's the era we know. But one of the reasons he was so famous across Europe was because of this scientific achievement early on. And it really affected everything day to day. I mean, of course, electricity, but he had done a number of tinkerings with sort of the stoves that were typically in homes. And the Franklin stove was his invention, and it was so popular. Washington had it in his private study in the president's house, and he liked it so much that when he retired and he moved back to Mount Vernon, he asked for an exact replica to be made for the third floor bedroom at Mount Vernon. Franklin had, yeah, I mean, it's just like, and this is, you know, it's the preeminent houses in North America, and they want his stove, and we don't even really think of this stove as being one of his big contributions. So he was an incredible scientist. He came up with little things for his own room that would make the room more comfortable. I mean, he just was really an innovative and creative thinker in a way that we don't often give him credit for.
And he never patented any of his inventions. He just... people could use them.
Among which bifocals, the lightning rod, the Franklin stove, and the harmonica. He created the harmonica, which was a weird set of glass jars with different amounts of water in them. But Mozart and other major composers wound up using this instrument. But in the 1750s, one of his pamphlets on electricity was published in the European world, and it electrified the world, not to pun, but so think of it this way. Nobody really understood electricity at this time. And electricity, to the extent that they played with it, was kind of a parlor trick. You know, you made someone shock. You made the hair on a cat stand up and made a balloon, do something. It was still seen as kind of a parlor trick. And Franklin was not above that either. But he made this important discovery that electricity is a force out there. It's not something that's just that you just work up for a dinner party. And by using the kite, he was trying to say electricity and lightning are the same thing, and I'll prove it. So it was a very solid scientific experiment. And think of it now, we absolutely take electricity for granted as if it's always been here. But remember, this was a world lit only by fire. When people had candles at night, Jefferson had a whale oil lamp that he had to climb up on a ladder and refill, and he could barely afford to buy the oil. Electricity was just being recognized for what it can be in this time, and Franklin was the pioneer, and it established his reputation throughout the learned world. And people, I don't know how, it'd be like inventing rocketry or understanding the DNA system. It was that important, and so we can never give it the kind of emphasis that it really deserves.
Let's move, Franklin, to the American Revolution. Now, Clay, you wrote that he was late to the revolution, and he was suspected by some to be being pro-British, possibly a double agent. But he had a major role in the Constitutional Convention when things were really breaking down, and he made some famous statements that really ring true today. And I'll leave that for your comment, sir.
Well, he's this elderly man by now, and he's really there for symbolic purposes. He was brought in on a sedan chair, which is like a little mini Uber, and the people who carried it were prisoners from the Walnut Street jail, and it was like they were doing work relief to carry the eminent Franklin because his kidney stones and his gout were such that he couldn't walk, and a carriage would jar him too much. So he's being sort of brought in on eggshells for this, and everyone gets it. This is Franklin, and for some people that's roll your eyes, and for most people it's this eminent, elderly, great man. And he made a number of speeches at the Constitutional Convention, most of which were beside the point and sort of off. And he often had somebody else read them because he was even too weak to read out loud. But he did a couple of things that really matter. One is that when the things were breaking down, and particularly over big states and little states, which behind, as usual, there was slavery. But when this was all breaking down and it looked like the thing might fall apart, he stood up one day and said, maybe we need prayer. I found that prayer can actually have a calming effect. And he suggested that they bring in a chaplain. And I think Hamilton, Lindsay, you tell me if this is true, Hamilton has said we don't need to bring in foreign auxiliaries. That sounds a little apocryphal to me, but they nixed it. They wouldn't do it. They wouldn't do it. And then secondly, at the end, of course, he gave this great speech saying, I'm not sure that it's the best constitution. Many things could probably be done better, but I'm not sure it's not the best we're going to get. And and he goes on this whole thing. He says, I urge you to sign it unanimously, because if we don't sign it unanimously, then the country's going to see that there was division, and this is probably our best. He said it much more beautifully than I'm paraphrasing it, but that's what he basically said. I'm not sure it's not the best, and I'm sure it's the best we're going to get. And then in the end, of course, the famous moment when they're walking out, and I think the wife of the mayor of Philadelphia approached him and said,
I think it was Elizabeth William Powell.
And who is she?
So the Powell family, it very well may be that Samuel Powell was the mayor at the time. I don't remember. But Elizabeth William Powell was both a very good friend of Washington, but also one of the elite women in Philadelphia at the time, was a regular hostess. So all of these people were coming to her house for dinner during the summer of 1787 when this is taking place. And she was seeing them regularly. She was hosting them regularly. She was talking to them regularly. And she happens to cross paths with him, and then I don't want to take the wind out of your sails.
No, not a bit. And thank you for saying that, because, it's often said, well, a woman came up to him, but you're saying she was a key figure in the Philadelphia circles and not some random citizen, which I think is very important, that she's sort of a salon hostess in our own country, when Philadelphia was the intellectual capital of the New World. But anyway, as we all know, she said, what have you given us? And Franklin said, Madam, a republic, if you can keep it. A republic, if you can keep it. And this is actually a true story. This sounds apocryphal. It sounds like a myth, but it isn't. And of course, it's the absolute greatest thing that Franklin could say, right, Lindsay?
It really is. And the context of him saying this is so important because it's 1787. It's just a couple of years before he dies. Everyone knows he's sort of on his last leg. He, as you said, is there as a figurehead. The other really important thing he does at the Constitutional Convention is he forces the delegates to think about what will happen when Washington was not president and someone might not act with as much trust in the office. He says, we really need to talk about this, guys.
He's the only one who can. He's the only one who can say that, because here's Washington right there, and so you're saying we're not always going to have this guy, and you could easily offend Washington if Hamilton had said that or Gouverneur Morris had said that. Franklin can get away with anything at this point. But go ahead. Yeah,
no, I think you're totally right. He's the only person that could say it. He was the one that was supposed to nominate Washington as the president of the convention, but he was sick that day, so the Pennsylvania convention did it unanimously so as to sort of give the same impact. But when he says this at the end, it's such a remarkable statement because it's someone who has seen for decades the amount of work that goes in to create this new nation, the amount of work that goes into trying to hold it together, to provide the international recognition, the financial support. He has been intimately involved with every single step. And he was an intellectual person. He was a student of history. He knew how republics typically went at that time. So did, everyone else that was present on that particular day. And so he is, speaking to the future. He's not really speaking to contemporaries. He's speaking to the future. And he's saying, this is going to take a lot of work to sustain, and you can't take it for granted. And I think for most of the United States, we've often taken it for granted.
Not now.
Not now.
So, Lindsay, let me ask you a question I've never asked you before. What did your man Washington think of Dr. Franklin?
So they had a really interesting relationship because Washington was a little bit older than Jefferson and Hamilton. He was definitely not Franklin's contemporary, as we've discussed. He was 3 decades younger, but they had crossed paths many times starting in the 7 Years' War. So they had a long-term relationship. I think Washington was very respectful of Franklin, very respectful of Franklin's service. He felt like he could learn from Franklin. They often socialized outside of official workday behavior. So some of my favorite Washington stories actually include Franklin. They went to dinner after the very last night of the Constitutional Convention, and they had dinner with the Spanish minister. Franklin and the Spanish minister were talking about Don Quixote, and Washington hadn't read it and was a little embarrassed that he hadn't read it. And so he went out to the bookstore the next day and bought a copy and went home to read it and to make sure he understood what they were talking about. And several months later, another copy arrives, and it's from the Spanish minister. And he said, this was the most beautifully illustrated copy I could find. Fortunately, it was in Spanish, which Washington couldn't read. But nonetheless, it was a very nice gesture. And both of those copies are still in the Mount Vernon Library today. But I love that story because, Washington is there engaging with this discourse with Franklin at a time when, they had just created a new constitution and they're talking about Don Quixote. Washington was so respectful of Franklin. Ed Larson wrote a book, so Washington and Franklin, Franklin and Washington, that came out in 2020. And the opening vignette of it is when Washington goes to meet with Franklin before the Constitutional Convention. And he walks to Franklin's house, partly because it's only a couple blocks away, but also because if he took his carriage, the carriage would be manned by enslaved valets. And at this point, Franklin is an ardent abolitionist. And so out of respect for those concerns, Washington did not bring his enslaved valets to the house.
That's both of those are great stories. The story of Don Quixote, because, of course, as you know, Washington always felt insecure about his educational achievements. He didn't know other languages. He wasn't deeply read. He was pretty well read, but he wasn't deeply read. He was no Jefferson. He was not even a Hamilton, and certainly not a Franklin. And so to be in that room and not just somehow go back into a kind of a sternness, but to go out the next day and buy a copy of Don Quixote, that says something wonderful about George Washington, I think. And right at the end of this long business, Jefferson claimed he read Don Quixote while sailing from Boston to the Old World in 19 days. He said he learned Spanish and read Don Quixote on that trip, and to which John Quincy Adams said, yeah, right.
Well, we're talking about Jefferson. There's another point that you brought up, Clay, and that was that Franklin gave Jefferson the last installment of his autobiography to see to publication.
When Jefferson came back from France in 1789, he married off his daughter within a few weeks to her cousin, and then he came to New York to take up his position as America's first Secretary of State, and along the way he stopped in Philadelphia to see Franklin, who was dying. Everyone knew that Franklin was now on his deathbed, and Franklin welcomed Jefferson, and Jefferson went into his bedroom and sat there, and they talked about their mutual friends in France and how the revolution was going in France and so on and so forth. And then at the end, Franklin said to Jefferson, young man, I wonder if you'd do me an important favor. Here's the last installment of the autobiography. Would you be willing to see it through the press? And of course, Jefferson just loves this. This is exactly the kind of thing Jefferson most wants to do. And so he likes us to know that he was one of the last people ever to see Dr. Franklin alive. It's one of those little boasting moments for Thomas Jefferson that you don't often see in him.
In some ways, his last act to share this with Jefferson is both fitting politically and a very interesting counterpoint to, I know one of the other topics on our list is his last statement on slavery. And on one hand, he's sort of giving his vote of support to Jefferson, and on the other, totally sticking his thumb up his nose at him. And so, I think it's a good thing for us to talk about this last pamphlet because it is truly remarkable and so Franklin.
Very late in his life, 1790, he presented a petition to the Congress calling on Congress to do the right thing on slavery, and it was one of the first of such petitions which there were iteration after iteration of through the first half of the 19th century, and Southerners in Congress erupted in wrath, and this should never be talked about, and how dare this come up. And so then Franklin had been stymied, although he'd certainly gotten the attention of everybody, and of course he was on his way out, so he could say anything he wanted to say now. He'd been pretty quiet about slavery through much of his life, and he had owned some enslaved people too. But now, Lindsay, he wrote a satirical piece for the press.
Yes. So, he had signed on to this anti-slavery pamphlet in Congress, and then the people who yelped the loudest about this anti-slavery pamphlet had actually been some of the people in Congress who had accused him maybe of not being American enough. So to take real sweet vengeance with this moment, he wrote a satirical pamphlet, and no one did satirical pamphlets better than Franklin. And he wrote this story because the defense of slavery that was offered in Congress was biblical. And it talked about how the slavery was in the Bible and it was totally fine. And so he wrote this satirical pamphlet where there was a Muslim ruler, and because the Quran endorsed slavery, they were going to hold in bondage white slaves. And, kind of builds out the same argument that the Southerners were putting forth in Congress, but from the perspective of Muslim slaveholders and white slaves.
It's in first person. It's first person by the Islamic leader saying, yes, this is our defense of it. And it was identical to the defense of slavery by American Southerners, only it was Islam rather than Christianity.
Exactly. So it's really turning on their head the hypocrisy of the situation, and closes out by saying, of course this is ridiculous. Of course this does not make sense. He really got the last word in that particular argument. We have to close. I just want to say one more. He became a vegetarian. It's one of the funniest chapters in the autobiography. He became an ardent believer in vegetarianism and we should never kill anything. And but then he was at sea, and they were cooking fish, and he smelled it, and he got a hankering for fish so great that he ate it. And then he says, and then I realized that everything eats somebody else, and it's a dog-eat-dog world, and really this is sort of the nature of things. He says, so I dined upon cod very heartily, and continued to eat with other people, returning only now and then occasionally to a vegetable diet. And then this, so convenient a thing it is to be a reasonable creature, since it enables one to find or make a reason for everything one has a mind to do. That's Dr. Franklin. Lindsay, we love you. Thank you. Great snark today. David, thank you. We'll see you all next week for another important edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.